Hello everyone, it's James from Teresa's Sound World. Now I'm doing a video review tonight. I was going to do it as a written review, but it just wasn't working and I thought it was best to do it as a video, better format for this. It's a review of a film that came out in 1981. It's a music documentary. It's following punk bands around on the road, among other things, and it's called D.O.A. A Rite of Passage. And here I've got it on Blu-ray, and with the set you get a DVD as well of the film. But anyway, this film can sometimes be spelt Rite as in R-I-T-E or Rite R-I-G-H-T. I've never been able to figure out why there's a difference sometimes with different releases of this, but it doesn't really matter. But anyway, this film is basically the director, Lech Kowalski. He's quite famous for other punk documentaries, but this is his most famous. He followed different punk bands around in the late 70s, most notably the Sex Pistols on their last tour, which was a tour of the States. And there's other bands as well in this, live performances of bands like UK bands like Sham 69, X-Ray Specs, Generation X. There's also the Rich Kids as well. And then there's some US bands as well, including the Dead Boys, but it's mainly UK bands. There's also an amateur punk band called Terry and the Idiots, and I'll get onto them in a bit. But this film, I first came across it when I was at university, and a lot of my friends were older and into punk, and I was sort of gradually getting more and more into punk on their recommendation, and one of them put this film on. He had it on VHS taped off the TV, and I've always loved it ever since, really. It is a music film, but what's brilliant about it is it's got this real social history aspect to it. The filmmaker films the performances, but also intercuts it with little snippets of fans and interacting with the fans, people on the street, like street preachers, police, people like that. There's also interviews with record shop owners. There's one record shop owner, and he's talking about bands as if they're really obscure, like Blondie and Talking Heads, when, you know, I suppose they were at that time, and now they're so well known. But yeah, it also shows a lot of how different life was in the UK and the US in the 70s. I mean, over here, I can remember that as a little kid, actually. It just almost seems more like the 1960s, and the US almost seems like the early 80s. It's very strange when you see it, and also a lot of the punk fans as well. The US ones tend to look a bit more modern than the UK ones, but even then, the UK ones look even more modern than your average person in the street in the UK. Everyone looks very drab and formal. The filmmaker captures so much of the period as well, like all the derelict buildings and tenement blocks as well. That would be projects if you're watching in the US. But there's a lot of that as well, and horrible grimy 1970s school kids in big flares, and they're all wearing these what we used to call snorkel parkas with furry hoods, and it's actually quite depressing, you know. And a lot of the cars and things like that look very different in the UK. They look like antiques compared with the US ones. Sorry, I just got to let my dog out 1 second. You naughty doggy. Go on. Come on out. Sorry about that. But anyway, yeah, so there's a lot of differences between the UK and the US, and you get quite a lot of authority figures in the UK discussing punk in this film. The interviewer, I don't know how he kept a straight face talking to some of these characters. You've got Jonathan Guinness, who was the heir to the Guinness family's fortune, and some of the things he's talking about, like like if punks were allowed, they'd be bludgeoning each other to death and that kind of thing. It's kind of like a real overreaction. There's also Mary Whitehouse, who was a very vocal critic throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s on, well, she's labelled in this film an anti-smut campaigner, but that was about right. She had a dig at everything from soap operas to commercials to family shows like Doctor Who, like in the Tom Baker days, like having a go at that show, but also at punk as well. And some of the sort of things she says are quite strange and controversial, quite amusing. She was a character who really pissed everyone off from the feminist movement and gay rights and children's rights groups. She really rocked the boat with her conservative beliefs. And then, of course, we've got the star of the show. He's my absolute favourite, Bernard Brooke Partridge. He was a councillor, a Conservative Party councillor in London. And some of the things he says, honestly, it is so funny. Like his attitude towards everything. He's calling the Sex Pistols twerps, and he's sort of saying that he's really pleased that he can't remember the other names of the punk bands he's seen. Everything that comes out of his mouth is hilarious, but he just represents a real 1970s that I kind of remember, where you had these very dour authority figures. And I think, although you probably did have those sort of people in other parts of the world, like in the States, it was a very old-fashioned British attitude, and these people almost seem like they're in the 1950s and the 70s. And unbelievably, this character, he only died a couple of years ago. When you see him, he is like something from the distant past. It's unbelievable how he's acting, how he's talking, how he's dressed. It's quite bizarre, really. But also there's nice little bits like the fashions as well. There's a bit where a couple of American punks who were, I think, sellers of the clothes are showing the different designs that they've created, and that's really nice, actually. They go through what all the zips are for and the handles on the clothes. I just thought it was really nice little touches there. And then there's the fans as well. You don't tend to get too much interaction with the UK ones. It's more the US ones. My goodness, that's such a bunch of characters, and they're also diverse as well. A lot of them don't look like punks, they're just very normal, but you get quite a lot of people who are enjoying them, and quite a lot of people who've gone there to cause trouble as well, which is quite bizarre. I don't think you'd necessarily get that happening these days, but obviously some people got quite offended by the Sex Pistols. So the performance-wise, one of the bands that is really good, you see X-Ray Specs playing Oh Bondage Up Yours, and it's kind of like half a studio edit in terms of visuals and then a live performance. And I'll be controversial by saying I prefer this version to the studio one. It's a really nice performance. There's a couple of performances by Sham 69 as well, the UK punk band, and it just shows them out and about as well, getting into some sort of trouble with the police, and it's very 70s scene, typical sort of disorder in the UK. But that band, they're one of the only ones at the whole list of them that I saw live. I saw them in the early 2000s, but they still had that energy then that they seem to have on this film from the 70s. And then you get Generation X, which has Billy Idol in before he went to the States and became the superstar that we all know. And actually, interestingly, bands like that are very much dressed. They look ahead of their time. A lot of the people, especially like I was saying in the UK, look very 70s, very dated. You see a bunch of football, that's soccer for non-British people, walking along and they look very 70s. You know, they look like the Bay City Rollers or something. But Generation X, they almost look 80s, and it's almost like